Aloha, and welcome to our 7th annual session. What we've been doing for 7 years now is coordinating a monthly forum focusing on the themes of human rights and sustainability. And in these 7 years that we're launching right now, what we're hoping is that we can continue the inter-island conversation and, more importantly, promoting positive social change here in Hawaii. What we focus on doing every month is bringing in speakers from around the world, but also featuring local activists to share the important issues and linking those with other examples happening at global civil society level. What we'll start with is just a brief overview of what we'll be covering in the 7th season. Next month, we'll actually have 2 guest speakers. We'll be focusing on Indigenous peoples' rights and implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We'll have a Métis attorney from Canada that will share some of the latest work taking place. She'll also talk with us about what happened at the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that took place in September 22nd and 23rd at the UN headquarters. We'll also be featuring Helena Nordberg-Hodge on February 24th. Helena Nordberg-Hodge is a scholar with a very important work in Ladakh, where she looked at the situation of globalization, but also looking at the aspect of localization, how local communities are organizing to defend their rights and promoting their cultural values over the current economic system that's being forced upon them. In March, at the end of March 31st, we'll be looking at the Human Rights Council, what's taking place, and also our last look at the Universal Periodic Review before the review takes place on May 11th, 2015 of the United States. April 14th will be our Earth Day session, which will feature a panel of advocates and academics and artists talking about what they're doing here in Hawaii to guarantee a clean environment, but also focusing on the Paris Protocol that'll be coming up in December of 2015, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals and how those will be created. So that's an overview of what we have coming up in the first half of the season. Last year in the 6th session, we actually closed out the 6th season with a focus on Sustainable Development Goals here in Hawaii. We looked at the important issues of how those Sustainable Development Goals could be implemented and realized here in Hawaii, and what impact that would have on our economy, on the issues of equality and equity, and more importantly, focusing how we'd move forward with our ecology to be balanced with other priorities in Hawaii. So that was quite impressive. We were able to bring in elected officials from neighbor islands. We also had people working on a national level with the UNA USA, and we were one of the cities selected across the United States to be able to provide input to the actual United Nations as part of a national dialogue of the United States looking at Sustainable Development Goals. 2015 is a very important year. As I alluded to earlier, one of the most important issues focusing on environment is the Sustainable Development Goals that will be adopted officially in September of 2015 at the UN General Assembly. But they already kicked off the final round of negotiations last week from the 19th through the 21st. In that 19th through the 21st, they were focusing on the important issue of looking at those 17 to decide if they should eliminate any, if they should mainstream others, and more importantly, begin to lay out the process for how they'll work forward for these negotiations in this final round between now and January until September. The other issue that was also important that began focus was the Paris Protocol. There'll be a meeting next month in February in Geneva and another one in June, but they'll negotiate this important treaty. And this Paris Protocol will focus on carbon. It'll be looking at the issue of trying to keep it at least below 2, but many countries from the Pacific are still hoping below 1.5 degrees. And another important feature of the Paris Protocol, of course, will be looking at the issue of adaptation. And many Pacific islands are focusing on the issue of adaptation, and our own Hokulea is traveling around Oceania in this part, but will also go throughout the entire world to talk about Malama Honua and sharing the different models of adaptation of what people have been doing around the world. What we're going to focus on today is a handful of important issues. The first one we thought we would actually look at is the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is a gathering in Davos, Switzerland, where they bring world leaders over to discuss some of the important issues. And what we have is just a couple of short films, none over a minute, where different people share and discuss the issues that they think are absolutely important and vital. So we're going to look at that one here on what we need to look at. The first one we're going to look at is Kofi Annan.
Welcome to this debate this morning, a debate in which I hope...
Let's see here, let me just renew that real quick. These videos right here on the top 10 videos were focused in featuring some of the important things, but we decided to come up with just the shortest clip on the issues that we feel were quite important. There was a big announcement by Al Gore and Pharrell about the climate change concerts. They're planning a series of climate change concerts, 100 concerts in different cities around the world. But also equally significant and important is it's on the 18th of June, just 10 days before the final round of negotiations, when they'll have another climate change summit in New York. So we'll look at that. But here's some other issues on shared prosperity with
This fight is not going to be decided on the battlefield. The outcome is going to be determined in classrooms, workplaces, houses of worship, community centers, urban street corners, in the perceptions and the thoughts of individuals and the ways in which those perceptions are created. It will be determined by our success in creating prosperity that is widely shared.
So we thought that was quite an important one, because the U.S. in the past and in many of our years when we started these seasons of human rights and sustainability campus community dialogues, that wasn't always quite the focus of the United States. Things were focused more with war, more with weapons, and we're pleased that we're focusing on what the civil society has been demanding of more words and, more importantly, wonderment of what could be possible in this world, as opposed to a position of fear and hatred. We're focusing more on freedom and hope. Another important issue, though, is definitely Kofi Annan, and he's been focusing on the issue of Ebola and trying to get the world to respond sooner. We think this is a great short clip from former Secretary General Kofi Annan.
Shouldn't we today be thinking of how do we ensure that when the next pandemic hits, I don't care what the name is, we'll be able to tackle it professionally, be able to research it, look for a treatment, and be ready next time it comes around. I think on Ebola, we have failed that test.
Quite a strong statement from the former Secretary General, because as many people know, there was not immediate action. Many countries didn't do enough when action was required, and now, of course, we're looking at what should be done, which is really good. Instead of focusing on the past, it's looking at the future of what could happen. But it's also still realizing how many millions have passed away, and more importantly, what we need to do about that. Here is an example from Al Gore's presentation.
The atmosphere, when seen edge on, is a very thin layer around the Earth. And we are now putting into that thin layer of atmosphere 110 million tons of global warming pollution, principally CO2, every 24 hours.
Quite a stunning statistic when we look at that, and that, of course, is why we started off today discussing the importance of what needs to be done regarding the important issue of climate change and carbon. And we thought we'd focus two more issues here. Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook.
So our agenda as Facebook at Davos this year is really two things, which is connectivity and jobs. As we think about the fact that only 40% of people in the world are currently connected to data, we see so much more opportunity for people to get more voice, for people to get more access, for economic opportunity, and importantly, for equality.
So that's one of the reasons why we decided to coordinate between the islands this way, so we don't have to purchase tickets to go every month, but more important that we can still communicate and talk back and forth. And also being able to show films like this. But then you'll see in the second half of our start here of the 7th season, we're going to be looking at the Universal Periodic Review of the United States and different ways that we'll be able to connect across the country to make sure that we get an agenda that focuses on what the people want, to make sure our politicians listen to where we should go. The last one, of course, is a little star power for Pharrell Williams, and he's going to be the main artist that will be assisting Al Gore with the campaign.
We literally are going to have humanity harmonize all at once. And I am very, very, very happy and proud to be a part of this, this moment for our species.
So you could see there, it's actually Pharrell Williams with Kevin Wall was on the right. He was the creator of the first live Earth concert when they attempted that. So it was quite valuable to see what they've been able to set up and what they're aiming to do. What we're going to focus on for the next part is really the Universal Periodic Review. We're going to focus on the Universal Periodic Review because the Universal Periodic Review of the United States will take place on May 11th, 2015 in the morning in Geneva, Switzerland. So that will be the majority of what we'll cover today. But we're also going to look at the important issue of youth engagement in decision-making at the United Nations. And we'll focus on here in Hawaii, upcoming activities that are taking place with a conference this summer in July. And we'll also look at the important issue and maybe the opportunity where we're looking at downsizing of the military as well, and moving forward to come up with new ideas of what we can do with the space that was once focusing more on defense and how we can use that for dreaming and determine a new future for Hawaii. So regarding the Universal Periodic Review, the Universal Periodic Review is a new mechanism that exists at the UN. It's part of the Human Rights Council that was created. And the focus is that every country in the world, no matter what country, will be examined for 3.5 hours by all of its peers, by all of the member states, at least every 4.5 years. So the Universal Periodic Review did its first cycle from 2008 to 2012. In that cycle, it reviewed every country. Not one single country didn't participate. Countries from as far as Kiribati, Tonga, all came all the way to Geneva to participate and be able to share what they saw were the biggest priorities in their country, but also to listen to their peers about what are the possibilities of how they could improve their human rights record. The United States in the first cycle actually appeared and had a record number of recommendations. It had 228 recommendations given to it from the UN, and it really set up a robust opportunity. This robust opportunity allowed civil society to come together to coordinate and create a campaign to mobilize, to really have a human rights movement in our country that we haven't seen since the civil and human rights of the 1960s. What happened in that time was looking at what many of the problems were and coming together and creating some of the solutions of what we could do together. One of the first things that we'd like to go through first and foremost is kind of the 5 phases of the UPR and how you can coordinate with the UPR in those 5 phases and what people can do. And after going through the 5 phases, we're going to look at 7 simple steps that anyone can take to participate in the UPR, no matter where you live around the country or around the world. If you have an idea, that could be transformed into an initiative that can then hopefully have an impact on an institution in the United States and be able to realize human rights. So the first phase that we really began to focus on really over 12 months ago was preparation. In preparation, we actually had small community meetings. We were able to host sessions on specific issues. And what we asked people to do was really share with us what was the important issue they thought should be concentrated on. What we did with that is this also created the important things of working groups. Around the country, different academics, activists, advocates, artists came together, and they created working groups based on these issues, clumping these issues together. So these over 20 working groups, what they were assigned to do to be able to have an input into the United Nations is they drafted, if it was just a single individual or a single NGO, they drafted a 5-page document. This 5-page document examined the history of the issue, examined the current challenges, and also gave an idea of what could be possible and how we could change policies and practices to improve the human rights record. If there was a coalition of NGOs coming together, they were able to provide a 10-page report. This report was also accomplished by many of the working groups. Each working group turned in one. Even the U.S. Human Rights Network, bringing together over 300 NGOs, turned in one 10-page report, and this kind of prioritized the most important issues here in the United States. A new working group and an important issue that wasn't featured in the last one, just to give an example, was human rights education. For human rights education, Human Rights Educators USA, along with different professors, along with different community partners and teachers in high schools, came together and hosted different forums throughout the summer. They met in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New York, and concluded in Boston in September, where they reviewed the results of those that then really were the essence of the 5-page report. And what they looked at was the situation in our country, that we actually don't have Common Core in many of the states, that we don't have human rights education actually listed in the Department of Education in many states, and that when human rights education is offered, it's usually from a historical context. It's from in the past, World War II, Holocaust, but not in a current context of how children and youth could be involved in being part of the solution with the challenges that our country faces. The other example of the human rights educators and what they're actually doing now, though, is working with governments, coordinating with governments and networking with the countries that sponsored the UN Human Rights Declaration on education and training. And what they're doing now is networking with those to make sure that their questions and recommendations will be asked in the actual intervention during the review of the United States. So this human rights educators was a great example of how just one group came together, participated, created a working group. In that working group, then created reports, and then was able really to bring people together in the United States that normally wouldn't come together. The UPR really, besides standing for Universal Periodic Review, stands for, as we wrote here, Uniting People in Rights. It's a catalyst to bring us all together because we don't talk about human rights enough. Mostly every day is focusing on the issue of economy and not so much the issues of equality and equity. So in that first phase of preparation, the most important task is getting those 5-page documents, those 10-page documents written so that they can be submitted to the UN, because that'll be included in a final report that the UN writes that's 10 pages long. But what's really important too is really that opportunity to organize people and get people to come together and have dialogues in our community, because people don't talk enough about important issues. We're focusing more on what people are wearing and a Super Bowl and certain issues about the size of a football than we are about the important issue of the state of freedom in the world. So the preparation phase is absolutely crucial. That was very important. We're now at the interaction phase. The interaction phase is any time after the reports are written until the actual review, which will take place on May 11th. And the most important part there is to actually make sure those 5-page documents and those 10-page documents and any new emerging issues that come out, such as you look at the issue of police brutality. While it's been systematic and historically taking place, when the reports were due, you didn't have the Eric Garner and the most recent examples of different examples happening almost every week in the United States. So that came up at a higher level, and you have a working group focusing specifically on that issue with impacted families who lost their loved ones. But during this interaction phase, the other part is you really focus on the important issues and give them to the governments, because those governments that sit in Geneva and in New York, they actually take the messages and give those to the different governments that then compile and create the interventions. The United States of America will probably be one of the countries that's asked a question and at least has a couple recommendations made by almost every country. This means the 3.5 hours will pretty much amount to less than a minute per country. So that'll be quite a task for every country to say exactly what they want to say to the United States within 1 minute. So it falls on civil society to be even more creative in our process of getting information to them. So we'll talk about it a little later, but that's where we do the 1 to 2 pagers and are able to get the information to them. We'll talk about that. The other aspect of the interaction phase is making sure that the reports, the 10-page report written by the OHCHR based on the NGO reports in civil society, and the 10-page report based on the OHCHR covering any treaty body review, which happened to the United States 3 times in 2014, where reviewed by the Human Rights Committee on our civil and political rights, reviewed by the CERD Committee on racial discrimination in August, and we were reviewed by the Committee Against Torture on torture in November of last year. So they'll take the recommendations from there, compile those, as well as any visits by special rapporteurs and any of the special procedures, as well as any UN agency, which don't operate as much in our country, but anything that they put forward. That'll be another 10-page paper. And those 2 documents, those 20 pages, will also be the essence of what governments will review and be used for this interaction phase. The final piece is a 20-page document written by the US government. Unfortunately, the United States has not turned it in yet. It'll be turned in February 2nd. That'll then make the 3 documents that will then be the core of the review, as well as the 1 to 2 pagers that civil society makes, and that makes up the interaction phase. Also during the interaction phase, it's important to organize meetings in your capital. So in Washington, D.C., we'll be having UPR diplomacy dialogues and country consultations, with the morning being dedicated to meeting with those embassies in Washington, D.C., and meeting with the UN missions in New York, and providing them, through a panel, the most important issues and sharing stories by impacted individuals and the chairs of the working groups. The other side, though, is also going to Geneva. So on the ground in Geneva, there's a lot of things that can be done. There's side events. We just did a side event actually last week where we allowed the main speakers on health and human rights to be able to speak directly from Vermont and Philadelphia to ambassadors and the High Commissioner for Human Rights without leaving the country. We Skyped them in to the actual UPR sessions last week, and that allowed them to also begin to highlight some of the important concerns to look at. This will happen again in March. In March, there's the UN Human Rights Council session, and that will definitely happen there in that context. The other thing, though, that's quite important is the UPR pre-session. The UPR pre-session will actually take place in the week of April 7th through 10th. And in that week, all the countries that will be reviewed in the May 4th through the 2-week session will actually get 1 hour each. In that 1 hour, 6 NGOs get to speak for 6 minutes, and the countries that are present at the UPR pre-session, hosted by UPR Info in Geneva, can ask questions and use the hour as best as possible to get a better understanding. It's not quite a lot of time, but it also provides an opportunity to lay out information, your 1 to 2 pages on the back of the room, and also you get an email list of all the missions that attended so you could follow up with them. So the UPR Info pre-session is quite valuable. But then what will really happen while most students are concentrating on their exams, what will really happen that'll be quite exciting is the actual UPR. The actual UPR would be 3.5 hours. Many countries are already eager to sign up to be able to come up with those question recommendations. And in that process, what will happen is the United States will start with an opening for probably around 20 minutes to say this is what they feel they've accomplished, this is how they're realizing human rights in our communities and across the country. And then the first wave of countries will be able to ask questions. Then, after probably an hour, the United States will respond for another 20 minutes. Then more countries will ask, and then the US will finally give a concluding observation with the remaining time that will also probably make some pledges and suggest certain ways to have steps that they can follow up. One of the things that the United States does at the UPR, which deserves credit, is the United States actually has a town hall meeting in Geneva. The United States has a town hall meeting in Geneva. Last time, 4 years ago, it was actually 90 minutes. This year we're hoping for 120 minutes. But what happens is you actually have all of the government delegation. Last time it was 30 delegates from all of the agencies. We had Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, State Department. And what's really important there is you actually meet the actual person involved with preparing policy and who's also responsible to testify before Congress, to come up with new ideas. So from that, you're able to see and begin a relationship that's beyond just complaining, but creating policy together. So this town hall has already been scheduled. It will take place May 11th in the afternoon, and it will be also live webcasts, the same way that the morning session is. So people around the world and people around the United States can actually watch the live webcast. You don't have to go to Geneva. You can watch it there. And also the town hall meeting, there'll be an office in DC where people can participate as well. And then that is really where most people are exhausted and have done everything they possibly could imagine. But that's really where the real work needs to begin. After the consideration and looking at phase 3 of consideration, the real step is important with the adoption and implementation, phase 4 and 5. With adoption, that'll take place in September. Right now, roughly 23rd through the 26th at the UN Human Rights Council session. And what happens there, it's an hour review, and civil society finally gets to speak there. 10 NGOs will be able to speak for 2 minutes each. And the NGOs will be able to, one, either state that there has been improvements, 2, that it's the same situation and nothing's changed, or 3, we hope not too often, that conditions have worsened in the country. And so what we're looking at is how to maintain momentum from that third phase of the consideration in May through the adoption. We all know that summer break. We know that's the time when most people want to go to the beach, and especially after the blizzards, everyone probably will not be focusing on human rights and something known as UPR. So what we really are going to do is we're starting a new thing called Rights Riders, the same way that they had Freedom Riders, since it's the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma. And what we're looking at doing with the March Riders and looking at the issue of Freedom Riders and looking at the issue of these Rights Riders is the Rights Riders will be college students and high school students and community groups. They will take the recommendations that were given. We're pretty sure there'll be over 300. And then they translate those recommendations so that it's regular, common, conversational language, and then organize campaigns to ensure that the U.S. actually does accept those recommendations in September, but more importantly, actually takes action. One example of this was the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a really important instrument. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is 46 articles, and at the time of the first review of the United States, we were the only country to not accept this important declaration. So our goal between the November meeting, where the U.S. was considered, and the March meeting where it accepted 5 years ago, was to make sure the U.S. actually accepted it. And then Obama did that on December 16th with tribal nations to tell them that the U.S. would implement and enforce this declaration. So that's one example of what can happen. The idea of the Rights Riders, though, is that people will be able to coordinate based on recommendations and coordinate campaigns and really move towards coming up with solutions. Not just complaining, but claiming their rights and stepping forward. So that will be quite valuable. Throughout the summer, we're featuring going to specific concerts and to speak and go around the country throughout the summer, wherever people gather, so that people know about the UPR, but more importantly, know about their human rights. And maybe the people that weren't connected or spoken to during the first 3 phases will be able to find out. At the adoption in September, it is important to be one of those 10 NGOs that gets one of those speaking slots. You'll be able to sign up the week before the Human Rights Council via the internet and hopefully get one of those 10 slots. It's quite a valuable and coveted space. You don't have to go to Geneva. If your NGO is not based in Geneva, you can actually make a video and send it in, and it'll still be shown. So that's a new edition of the second cycle, which is quite exciting. And then, of course, the final phase is after that 1 hour review, it's implementation. And implementation is really the most important step, where we take all the recommendations that the US accepted and all of the momentum that we've been able to build with this human rights movement across the country and begin to implement them to make sure that when the third cycle comes up in 4.5 years, we can actually have measurable results that show what could be improved and how to be improved. So that's kind of a long but a thorough review of the 5 stages. We talked a little bit about the documents. The first document being the report written by civil society, that's 10 pages. The second one being compiled by the OHCHR of all the reviews of the United States by the human rights bodies. And the third one being the US government report that'll come out on February 20th. What's also important, though, is to see what rights are included in the UPR. And that's what's crucial, is it's the most expansive opportunity to challenge your country. First and foremost, anything in the UN Charter. That's over 100 articles, so it's really quite important. And human rights is featured 7 times, plus the right of self-determination. The second thing is the UN Charter. Besides the UN Charter is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has civil and political, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. This is good because not every country has ratified the twin covenants, both the ICCPR and the ICESCR. So that's quite crucial, and we think that will be quite valuable as well. The other part that we'd like to include and think should also be focused on is anything your country's ratified. So it's a chance for us to see 1 year later what the United States has done. Different treaty bodies have different follow-up. The Human Rights Committee, focusing on civil and political rights, reviews in 1 year. We'll be able to say in March what they've done and what they haven't done regarding the 4 issues that the Human Rights Committee selected for the US as a priority. But also anything under CAT and anything under CERD we could bring up there. And then it's also anything that a special rapporteur has written. That can be included in your report. So that's important, especially where rapporteurs have visited regarding water in Detroit. And the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples also visited numerous communities as well. And the final thing is humanitarian law. So anything regarding US actions, regarding war and actions that we've taken abroad can also be covered under the UPR. So those are the areas that can be covered. Those are the 3 main reports. And what we're going to do now is actually just go over briefly these simple steps of what people can do. So the first thing is kind of essential. It's kind of like your business card, is a 1 to 2 page smart, simple, and strategic sheet. And what you're going to do there is introduce your issue. And what you're going to do is write 3 simple things. You're going to find out and cite what the issue is that you think is important, what question you want to have asked to your government to force them to really look deeply into the problem and be useful to you on the ground in your community at the city and county level or at the state level, and also the recommendation. The recommendation should be specific, measurable, action-oriented, and have a timetable. So when you're thinking about this 1 to 2 page sheet with the issue first and then the question for that issue and then the recommendations for that issue, that's really asking you to be a solutionary, to really come up with what's important and how we can coordinate and what to do with that. Because once you have this 1 to 2 page document, you can hand it out in Geneva. As we pointed out here, you can pass it out in the Human Rights and Alliance of Civilization Chamber at the Palais des Nations. You can get it to diplomats. Just last week, we actually passed out over 25 of those to different governments based on what the working groups had crafted, and meeting with those governments, able to say, this is what we're beginning to do. The other important thing, though, is this is really what you can email to all of the missions in New York or the embassies in Washington, D.C., or once we talked about again throughout Geneva, you can give them to them there. So the 1 to 2 pager is absolutely crucial. It's what everyone should have if you're focusing on UPR. Yesterday we gave a lecture at the Richardson School of Law, And if you didn't do a 5-pager or a 10-pager, this is still your chance. You can do a 1 to 2-pager and still have your issue included if you follow some of these steps. The next thing, though, is social media. So we're kind of looking at 2 different campaigns. One is, what's your story? What do you stand for? And what should we do together? And that one is looking at taking selfies with substance and doing social media campaigns and even doing petitions on various sites. The other one is a what's going on, what you're going to do, what do we want? And that one is short videos, only 2 minutes long, but allowing you to make videos instead of just writing. Honestly, most people don't love writing. It's only a certain breed of activists and advocates who get into this. So it's a way to make it more popular and to connect. So here's the what's your story, what do you stand for, and what should we do together? On that one, what we're asking people today, it's a contest of consciousness. Take it, put a hashtag, what's your story, what do you stand for, what should we do together? And it's a way to be able to get beyond people talking about the weather or what everyone's wearing, and actually what do we want in our country. And so we've come up with a couple of different links that we think are kind of good petitions. So once you do these photos, you can also then come up with the language. You can go to the petition site. The petition site right here is kind of an interesting one. Amazing things happen when you're supported by Care to Community. You can start a petition right there and put anything on there. So that's kind of one of the examples. The other one that you can look at is moveon.org. Moveon.org has quite a cool petition. Right there, you start your petition, you put the title, the text, who's your target, why you're starting it, and then you can actually preview your petition. So MoveOn is a great one as well. You can see how many signatures you can get. Another exciting one is Avaz. Avaz is getting more and more publicity for the work that it's doing. But here it is. It's one of the largest and most effective online campaigning community for change. You can just sign up there and create your petition and tell people to go and sign your site and use it as a powerful tool. And another one is Credo. I don't know if people have used that, but they're also a company connected to cell phones that ask people a lot of questions. So they look at the issue of a lot of things you can see here, but you can generate anything you want there. Of course, the Keystone Pipeline is kind of a big one. And Federal Reserve, net neutrality, kind of big there. And you can just start, you just go there to start a campaign today. And this is simply how you can start your own petition there. Kind of exciting. You got the petition title, who you're petitioning, what do you want them to do, why it's important. Then you also have categories. If you look there, you've got everything from civil rights to women's rights. And you can also note if it's a national or a global campaign there as well. So those are a handful, but there's one more I think that's quite important. Let me see if I can bring that up. Yes, we've got change.org. So change.org is also quite valuable. Kind of similar, you can see the pattern. You start the petition, you preview it, you publish it, and then you can share it. They do a good job at linking up with even being able to add a photo or a video, and text is also crucial to combine those. So that's change. One of the things we're also looking at, though, with these contests is direct democracy. And not every country can be Estonia, of course, but if you're looking at direct democracy, one exciting thing here is the White House. The White House has a new feature so far called We the People, Your Voice in Our Government. And it's not as good as Estonia where you get so many signatures and they introduce a law. But what happens, you can see here, is you can open petitions related and see if any of them are close to yours. If it's not, you can create your own petition. And 3, if we get a certain number of signatures, you reach that threshold, people are actually called into the White House for actual meetings, and they're able to see if their issue can actually go forward from there. So that's just one example of looking at some of the things that you can do with the simple things of simple logo of what's your story, what do you stand for, and what should we do together. The next phase is videos. And that's what's going on, what you're going to do, and what do we want. So in that, it's building on the success of the first cycle of the UPR. And what we actually did there was create a Testify campaign. With the Testify campaign, we can show this briefly. It allowed everyday people to make short films about what's going on in their community. And then we had a contest, and the winner of the contest actually got to go to Geneva to speak and give testimony. So we're going to show this short film. It's 13, but it just goes over this.
In 2010, people throughout the U.S. came together to report on human rights in our communities.
We are gonna overcome this storm.
Yes, we are.
Because we're gonna fight this battle.
We spoke out to inform the UN's review of the U.S. human rights record
during a process known as the Universal Periodic Review.
We wrote reports to the UN,
spoke with government officials,
and we submitted video testimony.
whether or not we were profiled because we were Black, because of our sexual orientation, because we were women. I'm not really quite sure what it is that we were pulled over for.
There's something scandalous to make a profit on the illnesses and sicknesses of other people.
Our stories illustrate the gap between American ideals and American reality,
so we can make real change to improve our lives.
Tonight, there is anger here in New York City over 5 police officers firing 50 rounds into a car last weekend, killing 1 man, wounding 2 others. The victims were Black and unarmed.
I'm already scared in New York.
November 25th, 2006 would have been a wedding day for him, but on that day was the day he lost his life with police brutality, shooting at him and other guys 50 times. They felt that they did not violate his civil rights.
How many shots have to sing before we hear freedom ring?
What's happening in Detroit is a subsection of what's happening in the United States. New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, New Orleans, Seattle, Washington, San Antonio. Many of the people that have died, the 300 funerals that we've gone to, many of them have started with the profiling in terms of who the person happens to be. This young lady here was shot in an altercation with the police, and this young man here was a father. He had 4 children. He was just walking home and was stopped by the police. He never made it home. It gets to the heart of the thing that this is really about the question of humanity.
I met an old man whose children had been tortured in front of him until he signed something to say his 2 nephews were members of Al-Qaeda. If you torture someone's children in front of them, they will sign anything.
My son was born in Cumberland Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. He was a wonderful boy. I was everything for him and he was everything for me. He was in solitary confinement at the break for 3.5 years, but I know he was tortured. You don't even treat an animal the way my son was treated. What are they going to get out of torturing people? If you don't want to talk, do you think that me torturing you, hitting you, taking your blanket away from you, leaving you in the cold, on the floor, sitting on the floor, not giving you food, and do you think that's going to make you talk? That's the reason why I'm speaking out now.
Yo venía de mi cita de cuidado prenatal y nomás de repente el policía prendió las luces.
The preference for law enforcement in Tennessee is to give a person without a driver's license a citation. In this particular case, the officer decided to take Juana into custody, despite the fact that she was 8.5 months pregnant and had 3 children with her in the car.
Se me rompió la fuente para tener a mi bebé. Cuando llegamos al hospital, que me subieron a la cama cuando carreran te suben a la cama, me tuvieron expulsada de esta mano y del pie.
Nashville has a 287G program in which ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, contracts with local law enforcement.
Por decir, me libré el domingo, tuve 3 días en el hospital. Me regresaron hasta el martes. En el hospital no me dejaron, cuando mi esposo no estuvo en el parto, yo en el hospital siempre estuve sola.
Nosotros, los trabajadores del campo, vivimos una de las peores situaciones dentro de este país. Y como también lo puede ver la gente, que es recibir salarios bajos, estar trabajando 10, 12 horas, estar aguantando el intenso calor, el estar expuesto siempre a una situación donde tarde o temprano a uno le van a gritar, lo van a pegar, lo van a tener a uno bajo lo que es la esclavitud. Y mientras que existe la violación, existe la esclavitud, existe lo que son los diferentes abusos que uno enfrenta, nunca vamos a decir que tenemos un mundo justo, un país justo.
Hundreds of people wearing bright red T-shirts proclaiming that health care is a human right crammed into a large meeting room at the State House.
It's a basic human right to be able to get health care. Fundamental, a moral human right. But since the market controls what happens with health care services, people cannot get insurance.
I can't afford treatment if it is serious. If I go and find out that this is cancer, I've essentially bankrupted my family. On the other hand, if I don't go get treatment and it's cancer, I've left them without a dad.
Probably at least 50% of the patients that I take care of never should have ended up in the ICU. I've seen people with diabetes, even well-managed diabetes, that ignore small ulcers on their feet that are easily treatable, but they can't get treatment for because they don't have insurance, and they end up losing their foot, or sometimes their entire leg.
Healthcare is not a commodity, but a public good. We look at our schools as a public good, our police departments, our fire departments. Why is it that we can't look at healthcare in the same way? We say we can and we should.
I think some people will say or would argue that the saddest day in New Orleans history was the day that the levees broke after Katrina came close to the city. But I'd argue that perhaps the real saddest day was the day that the city council voted to demolish public housing in the city.
This is one of the public housing development that's supposed to be demolished, that had over 1,000-some families living here. It just hurts my heart to see all this. Here's a family here was staying here. Where did these families go?
The problem with what happened with public housing post-Katrina was this.
All public housing residents in New Orleans were
forcibly told to leave their apartments. They did not have a choice.
We have huge contracts that have been let for demolition of housing. So if the money's there to demolish, not to rehab, you're going to demolish. The action follows the dollars.
I guess ever since our people had to give up the teepee, the housing became an issue and a problem for us. It's not enough, never enough housing for our people.
We have a certain unique legal and political relationship because of treaties.
The United States government needs to live up to their federal trust responsibility and provide what they promised in their treaties to our American Indian people in exchange for our lands.
As their council representative, I feel very frustrated because these are human beings living up there, you know, in this real bad living condition.
There are people out there with no electricity, no running water. Their houses are run down.
This is a problem, and it needs to stop.
Racial profiling's out there, and I am a prime example of it.
There must be means of holding government accountable for failing to meet human rights standards.
The idea of that promise that we can live the way we want to live and we can love who we want to love.
Face-to-face grassroots organizing is the only way we can ever leverage enough power to beat their money.
I believe that all power comes from the people and all power should go back to the people. So that's my message to the world, is all power to the people.
So that was kind of a good review of some of the issues we brought up in 2010, but also an idea of the videos that people can make, and we just wanted to discuss that. What we're doing is kind of 3 contests. The first one is What's Going On? That's kind of in the spirit of the song of Marvin Gaye. And what we're looking at with the What's Going On is to get people to kind of think, what's going on in your community? What do you want to share? Talk about what's really a concern, and then turn on the video camera and speak truth to power in that capacity. The second theme is going to be what you're going to do. And that's a direct question to our elected officials from city council all the way to U.S. Congress, where you ask them, what are you going to do regarding these important issues? And the final one is, what do we want? Beyond naming and shaming, framing and claiming your rights. And beyond naming and shaming and framing and claiming your rights with the what do we want, that really is getting us to think beyond complaining, but creating the policies and practices we desire. So we identify with specific languages and organize. And in our videos, we're showing that we can actually be part of the solution, and more importantly, giving ideas for what the government should do. So these 3 videos of what's going on, what you're going to do, and what do we want are going to be month-long video contests leading up to the May 11th review. Also, once you make your video, you can post it on Facebook, Vimeo, YouTube, One's Own website, and be able to get the word around so people know more about your issues. The next thing we'll cover briefly is the UPR Diplomacy Dialogues and Country Consultations in DC and New York. The first one was supposed to actually happen tomorrow in New York City. Mother Nature took care of that. That won't be happening on January 28th at the UN Church Center on the 10th floor as we had anticipated. But the one in Georgetown will take place on January 30th. And what the structure is of what we've set up is at this first round in January, we're announcing to the countries of the world and to the US that we want to have a consistent, creative, comprehensive dialogue for the months leading up. So from 9 till 10, there'll be a panel of presenters of impacted individuals and concerned community members sharing what they think are the most important issues. Then from 10 till 12, the people can ask questions from the audience, just like people can ask questions in this format, and discuss on a deeper level the questions and recommendations that should be proposed. And then what's really important, though, is from there, that kind of gives the essence of what can be brought up in Geneva on May 11th. But what's really important also is to meet with your own government, and governments don't meet often enough. So there'll be a lunch break, but then from 1 to 3 at every session, there'll be a meeting with the government where we can share a little bit of what was discussed in the morning. And the exciting thing about the morning is all these countries can actually give us good ideas about what we could do and should do to actually improve based on something that maybe worked in their country. So the morning is a lot of creative ideas. In the afternoon with your country consultations, you're trying to get your country to agree to actually do things. So that's kind of important. We've got 3 months that we'd like to highlight for you. The first one will be February 18th at City University of New York at the law school, just 2 stops from the UN on the subway. We hope everything will be melted by then, and it'll be a little warmer and hospitable for human rights work. Then on February 20th, we're actually having a consultation at the US State Department in the morning, and then they'll actually be, after this country consultation with the State Department, we'll be meeting in the afternoon at Howard University. Then in March will be an exciting time during spring break for many people. We'll be meeting on March 26th at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law, with once again the same format of 9 to 10 panel presentation, 10 to 12 dialogue between the diplomats and the people. And then, of course, from 1 to 3, meeting with the US government. And the final one is going to be quite exciting. That'll be taking place in Columbia then in March. That'll be an exciting meeting at Columbia Law School with the Human Rights Institute. And then the final one taking place in April, there'll be 3. And April 15th, American University will host. That's kind of significant because they hosted the only one we did during the first cycle on April 15th, tax day. And then on April 16th, Fordham will be having an event from 1 till 3. But the final event we think is quite exciting. It's actually at the Roosevelt House where Hunter College is, where they have a human rights program. And at that historic Roosevelt House where Roosevelt actually talked about a second Bill of Rights, talking about economic, social, and cultural rights. At that event from 9 to 10, we will have impacted individuals and concerned community members and working groups from the U.S. Human Rights Network speaking. And then 10 till 12, we'll have the diplomacy dialogue. But then in the afternoon, we have our final meeting with the U.S. government before we go to Geneva, and that will be on April 17th from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And so those are some of those things. The final quick things we want to talk about just briefly before we have the presentation about youth is a guide for Geneva to generate realization of rights on the ground. We think people should organize side events. We think people should organize side events in the UPR and the Human Rights Council. We also think people can speak on agenda items to raise awareness. But then what's really important is to also participate in the UN UPR pre-session. And it's also important when you have the media of the world there to have a press conference. And what a good idea is we just had last week with Hmong, focusing on Laos and Alliance for Democracy in Laos, was a candlelight vigil and a rights rally. This looked even more effective because it was held in the middle of a snowstorm. Those are quite valuable to generate enthusiasm and awareness and bring people together. The town hall meeting, if you can get your government to agree to it, is fine. And then definitely the UN Human Rights Council session that happens in between the consideration adoption is crucial, and then to be one of the 10 speakers. And finally, the midterm evaluations. One thing we want to talk about as well is the idea of creating a grade or a report card. We think we should have a report card that we can actually grade the U.S. human rights record. So it'd be taking ideas basically from each different treaty body review and coming up with the core important issues and then grading our government this way. It's a good way to have a discussion and everybody understands the difference between an F, a C, and an A, and it kind of shows how human rights is happening. The other two exciting ideas, the last things we'll talk about, is we're publishing a book, and we're collecting the specific recommendations from people all across the country. Ralph Nader on consumer issues, Cornel West on race. All the different people will be speaking and sharing with us their ideas, and we think that's kind of important. And we're also going to do concerts with local bands. Ozo Motley in LA, Snoop Dogg in Long Beach, Jack Johnson in Hawaii, The Roots in Philadelphia, Tom Morello wherever he wants to play. And the idea there is to have these concerts where we'll be passing out these new books that are only 1 to 2 pages, but it's really a recipe book on how we can change our country and make the country a better place. And the last thing is we're doing really fireside chats of freedom or National Human Rights digital town halls. And those will be once a month, and it'll just be on Google Hangout, but we'll have different speakers, really the people making the difference on the ground in our democracy, talking about an important issue and just letting people have a discussion with them. So we thank you for going through all these different ways that you can participate and be engaged with human rights in the United States in this very vital second cycle of the UPR. We want to thank you for that. I know we have West Oahu was trying to find the space, so that's good. We hope they're coming in as well. And now I really want to invite Don Peel to be able to share some important aspects about youth empowerment and the world we want, and looking at how youth, which are really becoming the majority, will be able to impact the global policy, but then also things we're doing here in Hawaii. Here in Hawaii, we actually have an important conference happening this summer that Don Peel is working on, and we look forward to him to share that. So Don, if you want to come up here, or you can do it from there. There you go.
Thanks, Joshua. That was a lot of information. I'm just wondering. Makeup. How's that? Does that work? Okay. I'm just wondering, how do people actually get in all that information? Is there someplace they can go to actually see those links, etc.?
Yes, there's actually, it'll be on the U.S. Human Rights Network, as well as USA UPR 2015. So those are 2 places that people can locate that information. And we're also going to meet with the UNA USA National Office in D.C. this week and see how much of that they can put up on their website so local chapters can also participate.
Great. Thanks, Joshua. The United Nations actually came out with a report that came out actually late last year, 2014, on the power of 1.8 billion. And what they're referring to is the 1.8 billion youth between the ages of 10 and 24. That's a demographic that does have a lot of power, and that's what we'd like to tap into is the ideas of the youth. And what I'd like to do is just sort of start off 3 videos on talking about ECOSOC, which is the economic part of United Nations. And just to give you an idea of what this is leading up to.
I want to suggest today that we are at a turning point. We are at a fork in the road.
Time for change is now, and the powerful agents of change are in this room today. Nonprofits, private foundations, corporations, and the UN itself must and will leverage their influence by partnering to advocate for gender equality. We will embrace what Martin Luther King called the fierce urgency of now.
Why are leaders so slow to embrace solutions that could deal with such inequalities and injustices?
In a world in which there is not enough money to go around and people die every time you make a mistake, it is immoral not to be relentlessly focused every single solitary day.
Dear friends of the United Nations, at this time of multiple crises, the United Nations is needed more than ever. Poverty, disease, terrorism, discrimination, and climate change are exacting a heavy toll. Billions of people suffer from exploitative and unsafe working conditions. The global economy remains an uneven playing field. The United Nations was founded to end such assault on human dignity and lead the way to a better future. There have been painful setbacks, and there is much work ahead. But we can take heart from our achievements in advancing peace, human rights, and human dignity. The UN Millennium Development Goals have inspired the most successful anti-poverty campaign ever. As we strive to finish the job, we are also shaping a sustainable development agenda and seeking a meaningful climate change agreement, all by 2015. The United Nations is also mobilized against the Ebola outbreak, a huge and global challenge that demands a huge and global response. On this United Nations Day, let us reaffirm our commitment to the marginalized and vulnerable and work in common cause for the common good.
العالم اللي نفسي فيه هو العالم اللي كل واحد فيه يحس فعلا انه قادر يغير وما يستناش انه يشوف التغيير حواليه عشان يبدأ بنفسه.
اللي بنشوفه في 2015 ان حقوقنا تتوقف من كونها احلام.
العالم اللي حابة نشوفه في 2015 هو عالم بدون حروب ومجازر إنسانية.
Posle 2015. je svijet gdje će naše različitosti konačno postati naša snaga.
სამყარო 2015 წლის მერე მინდა იყოს ადგილი, სადაც ყველა ახალგაზრდა შეიძლება განათლების მიღება და ისინი იგრძნობენ, რომ ამ მსოფლიოს აქტიური მოქალაქეები არიან.
العالم الذي أريد هو أن تتوقف عمالة الأطفال.
أتمنى أريد وأصر على أن يتمتع كل أطفال العالم بحقوقهم التي تمنحها لهم الطبيعة والاتفاقية الدولية.
El mundo que yo quiero después del 2015 es un mundo en el cual los jóvenes, especialmente las mujeres jóvenes, participen en los procesos de toma de decisiones.
In 2015, I want a world where everyone's voices are heard and respected, regardless of the labels put on us by society.
Bizler sadece geleceğin liderleri değil, bugünün de ortaklarıyız.
Ne istediğimizi biliyoruz. Gel ve birlikte yapalım.
So as you see, as stated in that, there was some missing voices, actually many missing voices. So this is the opportunity we want to actually take control of and start to engage the civil society. And actually the best part of that would be the youth, as it's pointed out here, typically who have not been engaged in policy development. The three categories that were listed in Agenda 21 in the year's summit were women, children, youth, and indigenous populations. So these are three exciting areas that we can actually make some changes of. So here in Hawaii, we have a real opportunity this July 22nd, the intergenerational conference coming up here, done by Generations United, who is an NGO that has an affiliation with the United Nations. They're out of Washington, D.C., and they're having their 18th annual conference. First time out of Washington, D.C., and they picked Hawaii. So we've got a host committee working on this, and what we'd really like to do for the first time is make this very youth-orientated. So we're going to, we've got a special theme to include youth into interacting with the participants of this conference, which will be international attended. And one of the things we'd like to do is enlist the Model United Nations student youth from around Hawaii to attend this particular conference and to build a dialogue about even the process applicable to today's youth. Maybe the UN process should be something that we should look at critically and see if the youth think that that's the right way to actually engage and formulate resolutions. There is, the Model UN has a format now based on the proceedings of the United Nations, and this would give us an opportunity to actually look at that and maybe make some changes from a youth perspective. So the other aspect is the World Youth Congress that will be bringing these youth together to organize the next World Youth Congress. The World Youth Congress is actually a youth-led congress that started here in Hawaii in 1999. And it became headed by Peace Child International, based out of United Kingdom. And the conferences were held in Scotland, Morocco, Canada, Turkey, and Brazil after the Hawaiian initial conference. And what's happened is Peace Child International is looking to relocate, and they think that relocating to Hawaii would be a strategic move. So that's one of the things that we would be looking at this summer as youth-led, would be to facilitate this relocation. And at the next World Youth Congress in 2016, what would happen is there would be an invitation to all the NGOs that are youth-led and look at developing a global strategy of youth empowerment using this revised Model UN. So that's something exciting that it creates a lot of impetus for a lot of new thought and innovation. And this could come as a result of this gathering this summer at the Generations United on future planning. There's also an opportunity to tie into the development of the Presidential Youth Leadership Academy, and which Hawaii has a bid in to be the actual location of it. And then for future World Youth Congresses, there's the possibility of welcoming the Worldwide Voyage on its return and in 2017, and to continue on this, building on this youth leadership in Hawaii to make this a very strong component, with the vision of perhaps the United Nations Youth Headquarters based here, the big vision. So those are some exciting things happening from our perspective in Hawaii here. So we'd like to invite you to check out the Generations United conference and perhaps attend. On Friday there will be a family fair, and the public's invited. There should be over 1,000 people and a lot of different venues and events going on in conjunction with that. And that will be on Friday, July 24th of this year. So mark that on your calendar. Check out the website. It's Generations United Conference. Just Google that to take you there. And join in this exciting, because and especially if you're youth, this is the time to get engaged and participate in creating your own future. And with that said, there's one other item if we have time.
Yeah, we have 3 minutes.
We have 3 minutes just to announce there's an Army hearing session happening. What's the name of the hotel, the Army hotel? It's
Halikoa?
Yes, Halikoa. That's the one in Fort Rusi, right? Yes. At 6 o'clock today, this is, what's today? This is
Tuesday, the 27th. Huh?
Yes, January 27th. And you are invited there. That's open to the public to give ideas of different options of what can be done if the Army pulled out of Schofield and Fort Shafter, with just many different aspects with regards to how that saves money for Hawaii and opportunities for the business sector, as opposed to what the business sector is saying now, that it's probably going to have a real negative impact on Hawaii's economy. But with some creative thinking, we think it's going to be different. It's going to be a new future for Hawaii, actually.
Maybe we could connect the two. That might be a good opportunity for Hawaii and people that are showing up to these testimonies to not just end it there at these testimonies at Halikoa, but they can use the Universal Periodic Review and come up with a specific issue, which of course is downsizing military, but also changing those different barracks and different buildings into more positive things. So specific questions that we should pose to the U.S. government, and also more importantly, recommendations of what we could use that land for, and by therefore providing an alternative vision that could then inspire people to include in the UPR, but then also to use for organizing here in Hawaii.
Right on.
Okay, well, we have just 30 more seconds. Want to thank Shoko as well. Hope everything's going well with your research here. Thanks for coming back, and we appreciate your presentation last semester on Ryukyu and the important issues there. And it's kind of a common issue as well as Don's bringing up about military and downsizing. It's one of the issues that in Okinawan and Ryukyu they hope would be the same situation there, and that they could be able to allow their culture to flourish. So we'd like to thank everyone for our first session of the 7th season, and we'll see everyone on February 17th with Brenda Gunn from the Métis Nation, as well as Helena Norberg Hodge on the 24th. Aloha, mahalo.